much. Let me start by saying that in terms of ground rules, we'll have question and answer after my presentation, but feel free if I'm talking about something and it doesn't make sense, just raise your hand. I've spoken about these issues many times, and so it's no problem to have an interruption. But before launching into my discussion of what's happening with the flat tax around the world and why I think it's a good idea both in theory and in practice, let me put it in context what the Cato Institute does in the United States. We're a small government, libertarian-oriented think tank. We very much support the principles of the founders of the American Revolution, which is the notion that the state should be very small and individual freedom should come first, and that government should only exist to provide core public goods, things like national defense, court system, rule of law, but otherwise people should be free to live their own lives, make their own decisions, take their own risks, reap their own rewards. And so when we look at something like a flat tax, we're looking at it in the context of what type of tax system leaves people the maximum amount of freedom for a laissez-faire economic system where they're in charge of their own lives. And what's very ironic about this is that even though when we look at the American Constitution, with its very laissez-faire, very libertarian orientation of a small state, it's not America that has a flat tax. It's the rest of the world that's moving in that direction, especially Central and Eastern Europe, countries, the transition economies that came out of the breakup of the Soviet Empire. So let me go ahead and jump right into my remarks. And of course, as I said, the great news is that single rate or flat tax systems are beginning to sweep the world. Now, Poland, unfortunately, is not one of those countries. We sort of view Poland in the U.S., those of us who are flat tax fans, every time a new country adopts the flat tax, we sort of cheer and we put a little, pin in the flag in the map. So we have all these pins now in the map, and Poland is one of the big countries that we're looking forward to and that we're hoping that we soon get to add a pin to our map. And what's happening is that globalization, we think, has been very positive, not only for the flat tax, but for lower tax rates in general, for economic liberalization. We think globalization is very good for people. It's very good for people in the sense of trade, but it's very good for people in the sense that labor and capital can now cross national borders, and this is very good in that it's a discipline on governments, because if they overtax and overspend and overregulate, what happens? The businesses, the people migrate to countries that have better policy. And in this type of world, where the geese that lay the golden eggs can fly across the border, I don't know if that phrase translates or if people are familiar with it, but the notion that highly productive people and entrepreneurs and investors can decide if they don't like the way they're being treated in one country, they can move or at least move their money to another country. That makes the old class warfare mentality where a lot of politicians view successful people as just perpetual sources of money that they can tax and tax and tax. That's no longer possible. And our argument to the politicians is that if you want to make your country better off, you have to put growth first, not redistribution. That's still very much a debate in the U.S., very much a debate in the rest of the world. What's more important, a growing pie or slicing your existing pie in different ways? Now here's the number of flat tax countries, and actually I didn't update this chart. We're now up to 24. When I first came to Washington, there were only 3 flat tax jurisdictions in the world. Little British territories of Jersey and Guernsey that nobody's ever heard of. They're little islands between France and England. And then Hong Kong, which people have heard about. It's a very great free market success story. But we've gone from 3 flat tax jurisdictions back in the mid-1980s, and we're now up to 24 flat tax jurisdictions today. And it's really taken off. Even as recently as 2002, we had less than 10 flat tax jurisdictions, and again, now we have 24. So it really is sweeping the world. here's a chart. I don't know if you can read this from way back there, but it shows the various flat tax jurisdictions. Now, there are a couple of interesting little things here. Prydnestrovie is a breakaway region of Moldova. Now, I count them because I want to have a big number. I'd rather have 24 flat tax jurisdictions than 23. But no one's really recognized them, but they do have a flat tax. So I'm going to count them. But if you want to be really technical and only look at UN member countries or something like that, maybe we can't count Prydnestrovie, but if they have a flat tax, I like them. That's all that counts to me. Now, let's sort of step back and look at what the key principles are that might lead you to doing something like a flat tax. And as I said before, from the perspective of the Cato Institute, our belief is let's maximize the size of the pie. In other words, let's have the biggest possible economy with the most growth and the most opportunity. And at least in the U.S. context, the example I always use, if Bill Gates is getting richer or Donald Trump is getting richer, I think that's great because I understand that that's not at my expense. If rich people are getting richer, it probably means that all of us are getting richer. So this old class warfare notion that somehow it's always the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, that's not what we see empirically. What we see in the United States is that when we have periods of economic growth, everyone gets richer, and when we have periods of economic stagnation, everyone gets poorer. So I'm not concerned, I'm not driven by envy and hate and class warfare. I'm not focused at all on saying, how can I make Bill Gates poorer? Instead, what I'm focused on is what type of economic system will make all of us richer. And if you have that mentality that you want more wealth creation because that wealth creation will be shared widely in your economy, that leads us to argue and to assert that we need more market-oriented policies. And indeed, it's not just that we say that's good in general, but we argue that that's especially good for poor people. If you have a recession, I imagine this must be true of every economy in the world. If you have an economic downturn, the richest people in your society aren't going to suffer. Yes, their portfolios might lose value, and maybe their income will be only $1 million instead of $2 million, but rich people are always going to do okay. Economic growth really matters, though, for poor people, because if there's a recession, they're the ones that lose their jobs. They're the ones who are on the lower rungs of the economic ladder, and they can just fall off. And so we want economic growth, not because we're concerned or worried that Donald Trump is only going to be worth $100 million instead of $200 million. We want economic growth because we want to make sure that the people at the bottom of the economic ladder have the ability to climb up, that there is opportunity out there for people who want to work and make themselves better off. And we think that a welfare state is a barrier to upward mobility. That if the government comes in and says, you don't have to work, we're going to take care of you, what does that do? That breeds a sense of false reliance on the state, and people lose the social capital, the human capital of self-reliance and individual initiative. So we want a laissez-faire economy with low tax rates, and we don't want a welfare state because we worry that a welfare state traps people in poverty. Now, why does economic growth matter? Well, this is a very simple chart here. It shows how many years it takes to double your economic output depending on your annual growth rate. If your economy only grows 1% a year, it takes you 70 years to double your gross national or gross domestic product. Whereas if you have 7% growth per year, which is what Ireland had for a long time, what Estonia has now, your GDP literally will double in just 10 years. And then obviously, you see all the gradations in between depending on your annual growth rates. In other words, the key thing is growth.